of slavery is something that must be seen from two different fronts. From the perspective of the enslaver, it was one of the most lucrative industries, if you may, that they ever undertook. If you look at the history of Europe, the history of America, to mean the United States of America, to mean Latin America or South America, you will discover that those civilizations were built on the back of slaves. But to the slave, it was debilitating and humiliating, and the impact is alive today. And the impact is not only economic, it is spiritual, it is cultural, it is political, it is total. And one need only see what happened to the slaves who were taken to the United States of America. First of all, you lost your language. And I think Alex Haley has done a very good job in dramatizing it through his movie Roots. They took away your name. They took away your God. They took away your language. They took away all the things that you valued. And if you go to Latin America, you also discover, you go to Colombia, you go to Brazil, you see how devastating it was. You go to the Caribbean, whether it's St. Kitts and Nevis, or whether Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenadines, you see the impact of slavery. And not only that, if you move out of the slavery that we call the transatlantic triangle, and you go into the Arab world, where we now know that over 18 million people were transported, and we now know that men were castrated, you can see how they have completely been Arabized, so that they do not even think of their African roots. That is how devastating slavery was. And the impact continues, because once you have lost your all, you've lost your humanity. To claim it back, it is an intergenerational thing. We now know quite a number of people who suffered in the manner that they did and continue to suffer, trying to reconnect with their root. The DNA tracing is in itself a quest for people to find themselves, so that they can be who they were, and so that they can pay homage to their ancestors. The continent remains the richest continent on earth in terms of many things. And whenever people talk about riches, we are quick to talk about natural resources. But to me, the most important of the resources is the human resource. Africa was invaded and people were enslaved because of the human resource. In fact, I know of a story about slavery in Costa Rica, where the Spaniards were trying to build a railway from Port Limon to San Jose in Costa Rica. And they tried the Chinese, they died of malaria. They tried everybody until they went to Jamaica and picked the slaves who had been there, and they are the ones who came and built the railway to Port Limon because of human resource before industrialization. If you look at every other sector, look at the sugar plantations of Sao Tome, off the coast of Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo. They took people from the Congo Kingdom and took them to Sao Tome. The rubber plantations, human resource. Africa was rich and still remains rich. But what Africa is famed for is her natural resources. Talk of gold, talk of iron ore, talk of cobalt, talk of uranium, talk of rare earth, talk of copper, talk of all these things, talk of timber, even in terms of looking at our flora and fauna, and you look at what we have in terms of what gives the world the pharmaceutical products. It was true then, it is true now. And that is why when the European powers came to the continent of Africa and they were fighting each other, remember they were fighting each other in different corners of Africa. In Angola, the Dutch were fighting the Portuguese. In the other part, the Germans were fighting, the French were fighting, the colonials were fighting. And then they said, why are we fighting? This hunting ground is so rich. that we are just better divided into spheres of influence. That is the context in which the conference in Berlin that was put together by Otto von Bismarck must be understood. So they divided into spheres of influence because of the reaches. Even the decolonization process the colonization process before decolonization was based on the better management of the resources, so that the human resource continued to be a resource, but we're also using the natural resources to industrialize Europe. The Europe that we now see industrialized did so on the back of African resources. The America that we now see industrialized did so on the back of African resources. The Latin America. So Africa has been the place where you get resources and take it to other parts of the world, particularly Europe and America, and use it for purposes of the benefit. And to that extent, Africa has been impoverished. So that Africa is the least industrialized of all the continents, because at critical moments, both her people and her resources have been taken away, and all her attempts at industrialization have been frustrated to the extent that they have not realized their potential. So the impact is huge, but that does not mean that Africa is poor. Africa, with a population of 1.4 billion and increasing, the youngest population in the world, with most of the resources already still resident in the continent of Africa, we only have to change our mind and stop exporting raw products or primary products and begin to have them made here, value addition. Then sooner rather than later, we will be flying on a different plane in terms of converting our resources into things that will improve the quality of our lives. The paradox of Africa is so rich, yet so poor, a paradox. It used to be said, and it was right, that the flag followed the cross, that is as regards Christianity. And as Europe and America were subdividing Africa for economic reasons, they were also subdividing Africa from a religious perspective. So that when you look at Africa, you see the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church to be specific, is one of the largest landowners across the continent of Africa. In every African country, the Roman Catholic Church has large tracts of land. They are the sphere of influence, whether you are talking about their presence in Uganda or in Kenya or in Angola or in all those other countries. Remember, the Roman Pope was a politician. And in the 15th and 16th century, when the oceans were being subdivided for exploration, it is the Roman Catholic Pope who divided the oceans between Spain and Portugal at that time. That is the Roman Catholic Church. The Anglican Church, whenever you saw the British, they also came with the Anglican Church. And remember, I keep on reminding those who are in the Anglican tradition that the Anglican Church was created through a rebellion in 1534 when King Henry VIII was denied the right to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. And he became the head of the Roman Catholic Church. The British monarch is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. So this is an established church. Wherever they went, you see the governor's house, and next to the governor's house is the archbishop's house. Either it's in Kenya, or in Uganda, or in Tanzania, or in Ghana, or in Nigeria, or in Zimbabwe, spheres of influence. And where the Germans were dominant, you see the Lutheran Church. And where the Scots had a presence, you see the Presbyterian Church. So it is true that religion was used. And the Bible has been used in very negative ways. The Dutch Reformed Church, which gave the religious legitimacy to the apartheid regime in South Africa, proceeded on the premise that the races were unequal. So religion was used to dehumanize the black South Africans by the Dutch Reformed Church, which founded and formed the so-called spiritual basis for the apartheid regime. The churches were there when people were being colonized. They were there when people were being discriminated against, while the same Bible that they read said that there is no Jew, no Gentile, no man, no woman. Yet they allowed it to happen. The religion was used to pacify, and the culture and the whole idea of turn the other cheek. Religion did not preach being a keeper of one's brother or sister. Religion did not assert that we should be good Samaritans. The people in religion became bad Samaritans. And it is instructive that in the recent past, the Roman Catholic Church has apologized. The Anglican Church has apologized because they know that they were complicit both in slavery and in colonization, and that they continue to do harm in the name of religion. Islam is not innocent. Islam, which is articulated in the Quran, is quite clear about the things and how you should deal with people. But Islam also became an instrument of Arabization, which was not what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, prescribed. But those who are bringing Islam to the coastal part of Africa also used it to Arabize the population. The net effect, therefore, when you talk about the impact and the influence of religion in the continent of Africa, is that it's part of the problem rather than part of the solution. That does not take away the fact that there are certain good things that these religious organizations also did. We must not be all negative. It's true that in a number of areas they improved education, therefore eliminated illiteracy. It is true that they built hospitals and therefore helped in the reduction and elimination of diseases. But when you put it on the weighing scale, the negative impact of religion psychologically and otherwise continues to be an albatross that hangs on the neck of the people of color in Africa. And something must be done to decolonize religion in order that we may indeed enjoy the dividends of a relationship with God. And if you look at the history of Africa, there have been attempts at fighting that. In the 16th century, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, what we call it now, in the Congo Kingdom, there was a lady called Kimpavita or Donna Beatrice, who told his people that indeed, of course, debatable, Jesus was black and was a Congolese. But I can understand where Kimpavita or Donna Beatrice was coming from. She was trying to tell the people that we should not simply accept the version of Jesus that has been brought to us from Europe and America. And when Donna Beatrice left, in the same Congo, there was Simon Kimbangu, who also came and made certain contribution. In fact, when Kimbangu died in 1951, he had already predicted that Congo would be free. He had already predicted that there would be economic recovery. So there have always been Africans who have tried to appropriate the good aspects of religion, whether it is Islam or it is Christianity. In the Islamic tradition, we remember the activities of Uthman Dan Fodio or Uthman Dan Fodio in the northern part of what is now Nigeria, and his version of Islam, trying to give it an African flavor so that it's something that is positive to the people. So whenever we talk about religion, we must understand that it had and continues to have a very negative impact on African peoples, preaching a gospel where we think that prayer without work will be the mother of all the things we have ever wished for. Yet we know that the divine instruction was that you shall eat by the sweat of thy brow. You know, religion is man-made. And anything that is touched by man and made by man particularly many of these organizations, including religion, they have an agenda, hidden or otherwise. So the more religious you are, sometimes the less spiritual you are. Because religion creates hierarchy. You have the archbishop, you have the pope in the Roman Catholic, you have the cardinals, you have the archbishops, you have the bishops, you have the priests, and all of them enjoy Pharisaic life. They love life. And we have history of popes who engaged in all manner of criminal activities. And they wanted to be worshipped. In fact, when I look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church, and I look at how Martin Luther came out with his 95 theses at the church in Wittenberg, when he's saying that the popes must stop using the church for evil purposes. It was a rebellion against religion. When you look at the Anglican Church, you can see how religion was used to deify man. When you look at Islam, we have had versions of Islam where people preach everything that is contrary to the instructions of Allah and the Prophet of God, Muhammad, peace be upon him. And all these tell you that we lost our spirituality. And one of the things that Western religion did was to attack African spirituality, so that you lost your connection to God. Because in many African communities, the connection between man and God was a direct thing. And you had your ancestors interceding for you, which they said was unchristian, but yet when you are Christian, you pray to the God of Abraham, Moses, and Joseph, who are their ancestors, and they tell us we must not mention our ancestors when we are praying. So it is true that one of the things that attacks spirituality and creates a distance between us and God is organized religion, which we now know by dint of history, and even as we observe today, has some of the most corrupt practices, some of the most pernicious practices against men. We have seen cultic religions which have come where individuals become rich at the expense of their congregants. Religion is the thief of spirituality. You know, when you look at religion, specifically spirituality rather than religion, God, in his own divine way, having created man, ensured that man's environment, wherever he or she was, whether he's in Europe or America or in the Middle East, there is a sense in which your connection with him, to mean God, was mediated through many ways, including nature. And you look at every tradition, even if you choose to look at the books which are written, many African spirituality is not rendered in written books which were destroyed. But look at the Christian Bible and the Old Testament, which is fundamentally the Jewish Torah. You can see how they were praying to their God, how they went to the mountains, how they had prophets such as Elijah saying that it will not rain, and then it did not. What is the difference between Elijah and some of our seers amongst the Agikoyo of Kenya, or amongst the Zulu of South Africa, or amongst the Luo then of Sudan, or amongst the Yoruba, or amongst the Igbo, or amongst the Nama in what is present-day Namibia, or among the Temne, or among the Wolof, or among the Dogon in Mali? There is no difference. And those who want to destroy and confuse you, when they come and attack you, the first thing they do is to attack your God, attack your spirituality, because once there is a spiritual disconnect between you and your God, then you can be dominated, and then you lose everything. Look at in the area of pharmaceuticals. We had healers in African land. We now know that brain surgery was undertaken in the continent of Africa. We now know that there were cesarean births in the continent of Africa. But when we were disrupted, we lost all that, and we now think that in order to be a doctor, you must be trained in the tradition of the Western world. But if you look at other civilizations which have borrowed and which have survived and which retained their mode of doing things, they continued with their way of doing. Go to China. You still talk about Chinese medicine because they did not lose. And that has not prevented them from embracing what is good from other civilizations. Go to India, Ayurveda, and you find that the Indians have continued with that particular tradition. But when you come to Africa, when we have our herbalists, because we are mentally confused, courtesy of miseducation and spiritual dominance, when we have people who are healers in our society, we condemn them as witch doctors. So it is the battle against the impact of slavery and colonization combined is a battle of unlearning many negative things which were pumped into our minds so that we could become robots. And robots we have become in many ways because we do things simply because certain information was pumped in our heads. We have been taught consistently to hate ourselves and to love the things that belong to others. So when we have conversations about religion and about the impact of slavery, it is a conversation which is reminding us that we should go back to ourselves. There is a beautiful saying in the Kiswahili language called mwachamila ni mtumwa. If you abandon your culture and tradition, you become a slave. And that is exactly what happened to us. We abandoned our culture and tradition and way of doing things, and even when we deny it, we are still slaves, mentally. When you look at African traditional religion, and we use the word religion because I'm speaking in English. If I was talking in some of the African languages, perhaps I would not use the word religion, but spirituality. One of them, as we know, is Simon Kimbangu, who was himself a Baptist, started as a Baptist preacher, and then moved on to form his own church, if you may, or his own religious movement. And Kimbanguism is an example of one of African religions which has survived today. In fact, in the year 2011, during the presidency of Joseph Kabila, they held a conference to discuss the life of Simon Kimbangu. And there are many Kimbanguis. In fact, it is estimated that there are 6 million people in the Democratic Republic of Congo who follow the diktats of Simon Kimbangu. And Kimbangu is not the only African who has been in that space. In Kenya, for example, we have had several African religious movements which were called African tradition religions. Akorino is such a religion in Kenya. Nomia is such a religion in Kenya. Legio Maria is such a religion. And if you go to West Africa, you'll find similar activities, and even in Southern Africa. And what has happened is that these African religions have much more spiritual rigor as opposed to the very formalistic Western religions like the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or the Episcopalians who are now in the United States of America and are in communion with the Anglican Church, or the Methodist Church or the SDA Church. African religion is indeed alive and well. And where it is, it resonates with the people. If you go to Benin, for example, you'll find them. And of course, those who are in the business of condemning everything Africa, including us Africans, are quick to dismiss them, that those are not in keeping with what we understand religion to be. Yet they forget that many of these religions are man-made and have corrupted the message of God.